It's an interesting thing. I tend to probably be an observer of generosity as much as anything else. And when I see it in other people, I'm so blown away by the level of attraction that it creates. Friends that are extraordinarily generous, and you realize how different that is from the rest of the world. When I was a kid, I was taught to tithe and tithe on the gross. And then in various church situations and meetings, like all of us, we hear about other people who are champions of giving, who push it to the next level. And, people that are giving 20% or 40%, or, I met a guy who was giving 90% of his income, and that always felt like such a challenge. But there was always this press and people, godly people, encouraging to give more. And I always kind of struggled to understand exactly what that meant until I saw people who had really given themselves to God. And then they ended up with a personality style that was reflective of this generosity in a completely different way. I don't know if it's appropriate for me to mention specific people, but I watched Daryl Hield, who is known to be generous. And I called him one day and asked him if I could recruit the president out of the ministry, Generous Giving, where I had placed that president. And that put Daryl in a really interesting position, because Daryl is known to be generous with funds. And Daryl asked if he could pray about it. And a week later, he came back and he said that he would never stand in God's way in terms of being a path of blessing for the ministry that I was then recruiting for, National Christian Foundation. And Daryl allowed himself and his own ministry to be extraordinarily inconvenienced in a way that God has since blessed dramatically for Generous Giving and for National Christian Foundation with Bill Williams there. And so I watched that. Other friends that I've seen who have adapted this lifestyle of generosity that's reflected not just in what they give financially, although they are really giving, but they give of themselves. And you see it every single day in conversations that you have with them, and they don't have to force it. They're not making little notes about how much they've given or what they've done. They just live out this kind of style that I think God lived within them. I think God, when they began giving their funds, that released them to live a spirit of generosity that stands in such stark contrast to the rest of the world. I've been a believer for 40 years now. It's impossible to say that without feeling and being old. As a 14-year-old, when I came to Christ, I was taught to tithe. But one of the things that happened when I was just a really youngster, I was married but 20 or 21, and we had given all the money that we had at that time, $5,000, as a down payment on a house that we were going to buy, and left in the bank maybe $800, maybe $1,000. And the house ended up having big termite problems. And I'll make the long story short, but for months we tried to get our escrow money back, and we couldn't. And one night we went into church on a Wednesday night and we prayed, and we said, God, now if you'll give us this money back, we'll just give it to you. It was a prayer of desperation. And I told Nancy, I wish I'd waited another day or two, because Thursday morning I got a call that said the check was ready. And that was the most, so Sunday morning, I wrote a check for $4,600 and put it in the offering plate. And Nancy said, $4,600? And she said, we got $5,000 back. And I looked at her, I said, I paid $400 to the attorneys trying to collect it. And she just looked at me and said, Ananias and Sapphira. And referring to a biblical passage about promising and then not giving. So we put the other $400 in. And it was interesting how that worked, because it really set a stage in a small way in that church. There were some people, the deacons, and some people that knew that we'd given everything, and it was encouraging to them. But I think it gave us the recognition that God really is in control, and we never doubted it after that. We saw just what I would consider as miraculous a story, and we got to witness it and be the uncomfortable part of it that God used to really to grow our faith in Him. And that faith is really the foundation of any hope for generosity. When I became a Christian in a relatively hostile environment. My parents were anti-Christian. And as a 14-year-old, I had to grow really quickly in order to hold my own against parents who were really working to kind of dissuade me of what they perceived to be this cultish commitment to Christ that I'd found. And so I grew fairly quickly early on. And it has been now a really comfortable life of generosity. In terms of growing, though, there was a time during our 30s when I was teaching a Sunday school class, and it was back. That was a long time ago. Also, the whole "you can't outgive God" kind of series, when we were studying it. And one of the things that Nancy and I decided to do was that we were going to tithe our expectation. In other words, if we were making a certain amount, but we hoped to make more than that the following year, we were going to give a tithe this year based on what we hoped God would give us next year. And then we would just ask Him each year to turn it into a tithe. And that was really, for us, that was a step of big, big faith, because we had no extra money, but we gave away believing that God would grow us, and He has. And so now we've got, I think, responsibility and an opportunity to continue to give in a way that is helpful. But it's an interesting thing when somebody asks you the question, "How have you grown?" That almost indicates that you've reached a destination, or that you're now an expert. And I promise, I do not feel like I'm anywhere close to an expert on this. In fact, it's intimidating to even be asked the question. One of the things that I continue to think about is, in our giving, whether we should give to multiple ministries, lots of ministries, and help, because obviously there's no end to great opportunities to give, or whether we should concentrate our gifting on just a few ministries. And I've heard people say different things, and it's one that we still have not grown yet to an answer for. Another friend of mine who I deeply respect, David Wills, who not only is generous in spirit and heart, he's the president of National Christian Foundation. He's the expert in these things. But I asked him one time about how much you should give away if a big part of what you're keeping is used to generate more. And David said, yes, the age-old question about the goose and the golden eggs. Do you give away the eggs, or do you ultimately give away the goose? I'm still growing in that, still trying to learn. Another friend recently on this very topic told me, he said, Price, I'd never want to give away the opportunity to give more. And that was an interesting quote. I actually put it onto a plaque and put it in my office. So this whole question about my growth in generosity, I don't know where it'll end up. I'm on the journey, and I think I'm honestly still closer to the beginning of the journey than to the end. I'm learning every single day. The biggest reward of being generous is being surprised by the result of your generosity. You give with the expectation that something's going to occur, and then the ministries, they do their very best to communicate all that's occurring as a result of whatever you've given. But when you're really, really surprised by the end result is probably the biggest blessing. A couple of years ago, I was on an airplane with a guy, and he was sitting right next to me, and he initiated a conversation in regard to faith, and his intent was to lead me to say the sinner's prayer. And not wanting to discourage him, I didn't tell him that I was already a Christian, but I let him kind of go through it, and then at the end of it, I told him that I was already a Christian, and I asked him what he did, and he was the head of a seminary in Romania. And so here is this guy who is the president of a seminary in Romania who is witnessing his faith to a Christian businessman on an airplane, and really did a great job. And I asked him how his ministry was funded, and he said that he'd received a fairly big gift from the McClellan Foundation. And I asked him if he'd ever met Mr. McClellan, Hugo McClellan, and he said, well, no. And I said, well, he's sitting on the airplane a few rows up. I said, could I introduce you to him? And he said, that'd be great. And then he got real nervous, and it was like he was getting ready to, meet the most famous person. And we went up there, and he went up to thank Hugo for the gift. And in just a stark, just amazing picture of generosity, Hugo was so gracious, but he said, I wasn't aware that we'd given to you this year. And the man said, oh yes, and then named a really large number that had been given to him. And to watch the surprise on Hugo's face as he realized that he had given this significant gift and that it had such a dramatic impact. And just to watch that was a blessing that I'll never forget. And so on such a lower scale, when you give to somebody and you forget about it, but they don't, and then they come back later and are able to tell you how that impacted their life and the things that they did, and you realize you didn't even miss it because you'd forgotten that you gave it, and what you didn't even miss ended up being dramatically impactful, important, and consequential to what God was doing in their life. It's an easy thing to think that it's all yours, but there's so much evidence to the contrary. I was yesterday in Nashville, and we're riding along, and the guy that I was with pointed out this unbelievable acreage. I mean, it was maybe 1,000 acres right across from Brentwood Baptist Church. And I said, well, who does that belong to? And he told me. And I said, well, does he live there? And he goes, oh no, he's dead. And I thought, well, then it's hard to think that it really belongs to him, and thus it is with all of this stuff. It's eventually it's all going to go, and there is a time horizon. The closer I get to it, and not to be particularly macabre, but there is a time horizon to all of this. And at the end of the day, it's not a frightening thing to realize that we can't control our health, we can't control our destiny. The wealthiest people in the world die, and many of them die young. And they, whether they're believers or not, would quickly say that the stuff was the smallest part of their life. And as a believer, that becomes, I think, increasingly easy. But it's not by focusing on the stuff, it's by focusing on the Lord and what He's doing in our lives and the eternity that we're going to spend with Him. A quick story, my dad, who was not a Christian, as I grew up, later became a Christian. And before the word generosity was even in use, my dad was a giver. And one year he gave away a significant amount. And a few years after that, my dad lost everything. Lost his house, lost his cars, moved into a small apartment with absolutely no net worth. And I asked him, I said, do you resent giving all that money away to various ministries when you had it? And without even thinking about it, he said, oh my goodness, no. He said, if I hadn't given that away, I'd have lost it too. He said, I'm so glad I gave it away when I had it, because he said, when you lose everything, you lose everything. He said, I'm so glad I didn't have that. So I think you've got to just kind of form a detachment to the stuff and realize that it comes and goes. I do believe that God wants our treasure, because where our treasure is, there our heart is also. And so it would be easy to say that where my time is, there my heart is also. And I believe that, but Jesus didn't say it. That where my talent is, there my heart is also. And I believe that. I think it's true, but Jesus didn't say that. What Jesus did say is where my treasure is, there my heart is also. And I do feel like it would be an easy thing for me to say that maybe I'm not able to give of my treasure because I give of my talent and time. And when I compare that to scriptures and to the words of Christ, I think it probably sounds a little hollow. And so I do think that I've got a responsibility to give of my time. And I do think that I've got a responsibility to give of my talent. But I think that I'm commanded to give of my treasure. Interestingly, I really think everybody on the planet asks that question. Now, they ask it from various perspectives. I think one segment of the population says, how much is enough, in terms of how much is enough to give? I mean, I've given this, do they really want more? And I think that it's a real easy thing for all of us to fall into that category when we get that fifth request from the same organization. And it's easy to say, well, come on, how much is enough? But I think that a smaller percentage of the kind of the general population has taken a different take on that, and that's how much is enough to keep. And in the keeping, we have to realize that God does have a plan for what He gives to us, and that He expects us to be a steward of it, and that a steward doesn't automatically, mindlessly give it away. But a steward prayerfully considers all of his or her options in terms of being able to give and being able to support and supply and be a resource. You know, there's one of my favorite verses in the Bible is Matthew 5:16. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. And I think that from a generosity standpoint, the most important thing to me is to be entirely aligned with the will of God for my life, and to not feel like He and I are battling out how much is enough. I don't want to have that feel. Now, if there's somebody else who gives more, I'm not going to resent that. In fact, I'll celebrate that. And if there's somebody who gives less, neither am I going to resent that. But I think that how much is enough is me getting together with God and realizing that I don't want to have so much resources that I don't need to be dependent upon Him. And I want to make sure that my life is a light that counts for Him. And I need to answer that question in the context of serving Him in that capacity. What I'll tell you is that I've got a group of guys that I get to spend some time with that are in the kind of the 25 to 40-year-old range, and they are real interested in building and growing, but they also do not have a what I would call the capitalistic perspective of accumulation, maybe hoarding, that maybe I grew up with. And what I see is that they, almost irrespective of their faith perspective, have a desire to be a positive influence. And so there is this kind of an almost trend towards social engagement and social investment. And so I take a lot of encouragement out of that. And I think the service that comes from that, while it's not Christianity, I mean, let's just make it clear, you can't get to heaven by being socially engaged and serving your fellow man. It's a great reflection of sincere Christianity, and I do believe it's a step that God uses to bring them closer to Him. So I'm encouraged about the next generation. I'd say I'm real encouraged. What I would say to my kids and to my grandkids is that I have the same desire for them that every parent, Christian or non-Christian, has for their kids. I really want them to have a happy life. I mean, I really do. That's what I want. I want them to have a happy life. Now, I know there are folks that have said that happy and blessed come from the exact same word in Hebrew. And so I want them to have a blessed life. But in very just natural earthly terms, I want them to be happy. And there's a lightheartedness that comes from not being anxious over stuff. And there is a release. When I was a kid, Mad Magazine was a fairly famous magazine, that and Boy's Life. And my mom encouraged me to subscribe to Boy's Life, and I had to kind of sneak Mad Magazine into the house. But there was Alfred P. Newman who had this sign that was well known. It's, "What? Me worry?" And there was this kind of freedom that comes from that lack of anxiety. I want my kids and my grandkids to be happy. And I don't think that happiness comes from being anxious over stuff or for trading my one and only life for the accumulation of things that I will leave here. And so they need to have that detachment. And that detachment from things is what will ultimately give them a platform for generosity, which I believe is where lightheartedness and happiness and blessing come from.